Welcome everyone to this presentation in Unit 4. This is Dr. Moore. Each of us has a predominant conflict style that we use to meet our own needs. In a dispute, it's often easier to describe how others respond than to describe how we respond. In this unit, we'll more closely examine conflict styles and the consequences of those behaviors, so we can gain a better understanding of the impact that our personal conflict style has on other people. With a better understanding, you can then make a conscious choice on how to respond to others in a conflict situation in order to better resolve conflict and reduce stress. There are 5 styles of responding to conflict: avoidance, competition, referred to in the text as dominating, compromise, accommodation, also called obliging, and collaboration. No conflict style is inherently right or wrong, but one or more styles could be inappropriate for a given situation, and the impact could result in a situation quickly spiraling out of control. We'll take a look at the 5 conflict styles, the advantages and disadvantages of each one, and consider when to use a particular style. Even though we may have developed a particular preference for one style, it is important to be able to stretch or work outside of our preference or learned pattern of engaging in conflict to improve our chances for productive conflict. It's been said that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So it's better to have a repertoire of tools to handle a variety of situations. As you read and study this chapter, I encourage you to refer back to this chart, which is in the text. It plots the 5 conflict styles in terms of the degree of concern for self versus the degree of concern for others. And notice that the avoidant style represents low concern for self and low concern for the other. Compromising is a middle ground, which represents a moderate degree of concern for self and a moderate degree of concern for others. Finally, the collaborating conflict style represents a high degree of concern for self and your own values and goals, and a high degree of concern for the other and their values and goals. Now, although all of the approaches have their time and place, you need to ask yourself this basic question, which I hope you'll reflect on. Is my preferred conflict handling style the very best I can use to resolve this conflict or solve this problem? Let's start with avoidance. Now, in avoiding, the value of one's own goal and the other person's goal is low. So the value of the relationship is low. It's also been called the I lose, you lose stance. Avoidance is characterized by deliberately ignoring or withdrawing from a conflict rather than facing it. The style may be perceived as not caring about your own issue or the issues of others. People who avoid the situation hope the problem will go away, resolve itself without their involvement, or think that others are ready to take the responsibility. It's also characterized by denial of the conflict, changing and avoiding topics, equivocation, which is the ambiguous use of a word or phrase. The word could be taken to mean one thing one way and have another meaning if it's taken a different way. Now, puns use equivocation pretty well, but in conflicts it shows that one is being non-committal. And avoiding can also be characterized by joking rather than dealing with the conflict at hand. Believe it or not, avoidance has some advantages. It can give you time to think. If the issue is trivial and not worth attention, it can help you deal with time constraints, so you don't waste time and effort on something that's really not that important. If the relationship is not that important, avoidance may be a good strategy. It may be wise to avoid a conflict with a sales clerk whom you don't know over a 5-cent difference in the sale price of an item. If others can handle the conflict without my involvement, again, that can help you deal with time constraints. And finally, it keeps the other party from harmfully influencing me. It's a way to avoid peer pressure. And also, avoiding a bully is not always a bad idea. Bullying is a major issue in schools and in the workplace today. So quitting a job because of workplace bullying may be an appropriate response in some situations. However, avoidance can be destructive if the other person perceives that you don't care enough to engage. By not dealing with the conflict, this style allows the conflict to simmer and heat up unnecessarily, resulting in anger or a negative outburst. Some other disadvantages are that it keeps you from working through a conflict. It reinforces the notion that conflict is terrible and best avoided, and it preserves the conflict and sets a stage for a later explosion or backlash. There are situations where avoidance is appropriate, such as when you need more time to think of how to respond, or when one or more parties need time to cool down, when the issue or relationship really isn't that important. Sometimes time constraints demand that we have a delay. We simply may not have the time available at this moment to get into it with someone. So we'll have to postpone it until later. Another appropriate time to practice avoidance is when the risks of confrontation outweigh benefits of resolution. Sometimes confrontation will hurt a working relationship. When it's appropriate to let others resolve the conflict. And finally, when to practice avoidance is when there's really little or no chance of satisfying your needs. Now, avoidance can feed on itself, creating this vicious cycle. One thing that happens is that people will avoid whenever they start to feel the anxiety and tension involved with a potential confrontation or disagreement. And this avoidance relieves the anxiety and stress, thus reinforcing that avoidant behavior. Now, another situation that the text talks about is the avoid, criticize loop. In this loop, you avoid bringing up an issue to people directly and instead spend time talking about them to others. This loop is quite common, and especially if you're good at your job, you can get involved in criticizing others. So you can avoid dealing with issues. Critical statements will substitute for any constructive request for engagement and problem solving. We simply make the other wrong, and yet we don't really give them a chance to correct. We avoid and we continue the criticism. Some people are terrified of conflict, but avoiding conflict can leave people being taken advantage of. Withdrawing from conflict leaves an individual unable to work through differences, and if it is pervasive, withdrawal can even stunt one's development. Physical symptoms such as irritable bowel syndrome have been linked to constant avoidance and something called communication apprehension. I'm reminded of a story of a very successful young businessman who loved to buy his mother these exotic gifts for Mother's Day, and he ran out of ideas. Then he ran across these birds. These birds were cool. They were amazing. They cost $5,000 a piece, but they could dance, they could sing, they could talk. He was so excited that he bought 2 of them. He sent them to his mother. He couldn't wait to call her on Mother's Day. "Mother, mother, what did you think of those birds?" And she said, "Oh, they were very good." He said, "No, no, mother, you didn't eat those birds. Those birds cost $5,000 apiece. They could dance, they could sing, they could talk." She said, "Well, they should have said something." You know, that's where we could end up too if we don't speak up for what we believe, if we don't express our interests and goals. Many people are uncomfortable with confrontation. You don't have to be afraid of conflict. Handling a conflict isn't the worst thing in the world, but letting one go unresolved can cause more problems. Let's move on to the next conflict style, competition. This is the I win, you lose stance. Concern for your own issue or goal is high, and the value of the relationship is low. It's characterized by direct confrontation, and people who consistently use a competitive style may come across as aggressive, confrontational, and intimidating. Aggression may creep in. A competitive style is an attempt to gain power and pressure a change at the other person's expense, or trying to win an argument without adjusting to the other's goals and desires. It's also characterized by expressiveness. It's important to note that it can be expressive rather than aggressive, and not berate, ridicule, or damage the other. A competitive style of managing conflict has advantages. It can be appropriate if you have to make a quick, decisive decision, or if the decision is vital in a crisis. It's useful if the external goal is more important than the relationship with the other person. It also lets the others know how important an issue is to you, so it can be used to inform the other of one's degree of commitment to the issue. The biggest disadvantage to using this style is that relationships can be harmed beyond repair. Also, continued escalation in marriages is related to unhappiness with the marriage. It's also harmful if one party is unwilling or unable to deal with conflict head on. As a result, it can encourage the losing party to go underground and be passive aggressive. People may resort to covert methods to get their needs met. The text refers to competition as a dominating or power over style, as it involves pursuing your own concerns at the expense of another. As a review, competition involves trying to win the argument without adjusting to the other's goals and desires. The conflict is seen as a battleground, where winning is the goal. The most common dominating tactic is the threat. A threat has to meet two criteria. First, the source of the threat must be in control of the outcome. And two, the threat must be seen as negative by the recipient. To be credible, the source must also be in a position to administer the threat and willing to invoke the punishment. Otherwise, it's an idle threat. The punishment must also be seen as something the threatened party wants to avoid. Now, threats can be constructive or destructive. They can be constructively used to highlight the importance of the conflict topic, get the attention of the other party, and to clarify one's perception of the balance of power. On the other hand, threats can be destructive because they tend to be responded to by threats from the other person. This can lead to an escalatory spiral. Threats are also destructive as they block collaboration and they reduce trust in the relationship. Let's move on to the next conflict style, compromise. The compromising style demonstrates that you're willing to sacrifice some of your goals while persuading others to give up part of theirs. Give a little, get a little. The stance is I win some, you win some. Concern for self is moderate. The value of the relationship is moderate. It's characterized by some gains and some losses for each party. It appeals to fair play and fairness. Both parties give and take to find a middle ground, and it offers a short-term resolution for peacekeeping. Compromise maintains the relationship and can take less time than collaboration, which we'll take a look at in a moment. Some of the advantages of compromise include the following. As I just mentioned, sometimes it lets parties accomplish important goals with less time than collaboration. It also reinforces a balance of power that can be used to achieve temporary or expedient settlements when there's time pressure. It's also a good backup method when other styles fail, and in general, it appears reasonable to both parties. The downside to compromising is that it can be an easy way out, so it reduces creative new options. To some, it appears to be a loss. Constantly splitting the difference can be a sophisticated form of avoidance, rather than working through differences. The next style we'll look at is called accommodation, also referred to as obliging in the text. By accommodating, you set aside your own personal needs because you want to please others in order to keep the peace. The emphasis is on preserving the relationship. The stance is I lose, you win. Concern for self is low, but the value of the relationship is high. It's characterized by preferring a cooperative and harmonizing approach. But smoothing or harmonizing comes from thinking that one is serving the good of the group or relationship, and it can result in a false solution to a problem. It can create feelings ranging from anger to pleasure. Accommodators are unassertive and cooperative, and they actually may end up playing the role of martyrs, complainers, or saboteurs. However, accommodation can be useful when one is wrong or when you want to minimize losses because you're going to lose anyway, because it preserves relationships. Used wisely, if the issue is not that important to you, you can give a little to gain a lot. And finally, it can prevent one party from harming the other. There are several disadvantages to accommodation. First, it can foster an undertone of competitiveness. If you use it all the time, it can be competitive. And I'm nicer than you are mentality can emerge. And it may reduce creativity in conflict situations and increase power imbalances. It can result in a pseudo solution to a disagreement. And also, commitment to the relationship is not really tested. The final style we'll look at is collaboration, also called integrating in the text. The stance is I win, you win. Concern for self is high, the value of the relationship is high. The collaborative style views conflicts as problems to be solved and finding creative solutions that satisfy all the parties' concerns. You don't give up your self-interest. Collaboration takes time, and if the relationship among the parties isn't important, then it may not be worth the time and energy to create a win-win solution. But to make an environment more collaborative, this style is characterized by open and honest dialogue that is positive and constructive, a willingness to listen to another view. Emotions are dealt with properly, seeking input from the other party, and a willingness to accept responsibility for one's actions. The advantages of collaboration are clear. First of all, it satisfies both parties, and the solutions are reality-based. The conflict does not conclude until parties are reasonably satisfied and can support the solution. And it's a high-energy style for long-term committed relationships. Let's highlight some of the disadvantages to collaboration. The main one is working together effectively cannot be rushed. It simply takes more time and more energy, and it requires both parties to be committed to the process. It makes a party seem unreasonable if he or she later decides against collaboration, and a collaborative party may appear weak to an aggressive party, and one can get stuck in a rut if it's the only style used. So when do we practice collaboration? Well, first of all, when the relationship is important. Secondly, when a mutually satisfying outcome is sought. When both sides or views are too important to compromise. When underlying issues need to be addressed. When one wants to avoid destructive means for handling conflict. And finally, when new and creative solutions are desired. The research on the effect of an integrating or collaborative style is quite consistent. When one learns how to use it, integrating is a very successful tool for conflict resolution.